Edward Hopper is widely acknowledged as the most important realist painter of 20th century America. However, his vision of reality reflected his own temperament in the empty cityscapes, landscapes, and isolated figures he chose to paint. His work demonstrates that realism is not merely a literal or photographic copying of what we see, but an interpretive rendering, based on the artist's perceptions. Edward Hopper was born in 1882, in Nyack, New York, a yacht-building center on the Hudson River north of New York City. He was one of two children of a comfortably well-off family. His mother's inheritance enabled his father to retire at 49, and he and his only sibling Marion went to both private and public schools. Hopper first began signing and dating his drawings when he was just 9 years old. He drew this picture on the back of his school report card. By his teens, Hopper was working in many mediums including pen and ink, charcoal, watercolor and oils. In 1895, he created his first signed oil painting, Rowboat in Rocky Cove, which he copied from a reproduction in the Art Interchange, a popular journal for amateur artists. Hopper's other earliest oils have also been identified as copies of paintings by other artists. In high school, Hopper dreamed of becoming a naval architect, but after graduation in 1899, he declared his intention to become an artist. His parents insisted that he study commercial art to have a reliable means of income. In his early self-portraits, Hopper tended to represent himself as skinny, ungraceful, and homely. Though a tall and quiet teenager, his prankish sense of humor found an outlet in his art, sometimes in depictions of immigrants, or of women dominating men in comical situations. Later in life, he mostly depicted women as the figures in his paintings. Hopper began art studies with a year-long correspondence course from the New York School of Illustration, in 1899. He then transferred to the more serious New York School of Art and Design, the forerunner of the Parsons School of Design. He studied there for 6 years. During this period, his work shifted from commercial illustration to fine art. One of his teachers was the American Impressionist, William Merritt Chase, the school's founder, who instructed Hopper in oil painting. Chase told his students, "Do not try to paint the grandiose things. Paint the commonplace, so that it will be distinguished." Although Hopper went on to do just that, he later claimed he wasn't influenced by Chase. Another of his teachers was artist Robert Henry, a leading figure of the Ashcan school, whose proponents advocated depicting the grittier side of urban life. Henry taught life class. The young art student in this 1906 portrait by Henry is Josephine Neveson, Edward Hopper's future wife, who also studied under Henry. The teacher encouraged his students to use their art to make an impression. "Forget about art," he said, "and paint pictures of what interests you in life." During his student years, Hopper painted dozens of nudes, still life studies, landscapes, and portraits, including self-portraits. Sketching from live models, however, proved challenging, and somewhat shocking for the conservatively raised Hopper. In 1905, Hopper landed a part-time job with an advertising agency, where he created cover designs for trade magazines. Hopper came to detest illustration. Unfortunately, artistic success was slow in coming and he was forced to earn his living as an illustrator for the next 20 years. It was only then that his painting career took off. Over the next few years, he temporarily escaped from illustrating by making several trips to Paris, where he could study the art scene. In fact, he mostly worked alone, and seemed mostly unaffected by the new currents in art that were developing at that time. When Hopper first arrived in 1906, Paris was the artistic center of the Western world. No other city was as important for the development of modern art, and the move toward abstract painting was already underway. In 1907, Pablo Picasso painted his legendary The Young Ladies of Avignon, although it would be years before it became well known. Hopper later maintained that when he was in Paris he never heard of Picasso, who was to become so important in the development of modern art in the future. During a visit to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Hopper admired Rembrandt's 1642 painting, The Night Watch, which he described as the most wonderful thing of his I have seen. It is past belief in its reality, he said. In Hopper's student days, he had used dark colors, mainly warm browns, dark gray, and black. Later, he put aside the dark old master-like interiors, falling under the influence of the French Impressionists. His palette lit up, and he began to paint with light and quick strokes. The brightness in these paintings, and his treatment of architecture and nature in the Impressionist style, attracted him, and would come to influence his future work. He spent much of his time in Paris drawing street and café scenes, and going to the theatre and opera. Unlike many of his contemporaries who imitated the abstract Cubist experiments, Hopper was attracted to realist art. Later, he claimed few European influences other than Rembrandt, Goya and the French engravers whose moody Paris scenes Hopper imitated. Many of these early Paris works are paintings of buildings and their structure. A sense of isolation already appears in these pieces, which lack any form of human interaction. His use of light and shadow began to develop in Paris. They would become the main focus of his mature work. Years later, Hopper would call the paintings from this period a form of modified Impressionism. At the time, he was especially attracted to the works of Édouard Manet and Edgar Degas, and their unusual compositions and depictions of modern urban life. In 1910, Hopper returned to the United States, never to leave North America again. He rented a studio in New York City, where he struggled to define his own style. Reluctantly, he returned to illustration to support himself. Being a freelance artist, Hopper was forced to solicit for projects, and had to knock on the doors of magazine and agency offices to find work. His painting languished. "It's hard for me to decide what I want to paint," he said. "Sometimes I go for months without finding any inspiration." A fellow illustrator and workmate described Hopper's depressed emotional state in sharper terms, seeing his friend suffering from long periods of gloomy inertia. Sitting for days at a time, before his easel in helpless unhappiness. Unable to raise a hand to break the spell. In an effort to progress, he repeatedly returned to subjects connected with the business of painting, the life of artists, and the studio. In February 1912, he was included in the exhibition of the Independents, a group of artists at the initiative of Robert Henry, but Hopper did not make any sales. In 1913, at the Armory Show, an exhibition of modern art, organized by the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, Hopper earned $250 when he sold his first painting, a work called Sailing, to an American businessman. Hopper was 31 years old, and although he hoped this sale would lead to others, it would be 11 years before he sold a painting again. In 1914, this work, New York Corner, was praised by critics as a perfect visualization of the New York atmosphere. However, they condemned his painting of a café scene in the style of Manet shown in the same exhibition. Over the next few years, Hopper focused on oil painting, but the majority of the sales he made were for etchings and murals. In the meantime, he continued to earn his living as an illustrator. In 1915, Hopper received a commission to create movie posters and handle publicity for a movie company. Although he didn't like the illustration work, Hopper was a lifelong devotee of the cinema and the theatre, both of which he treated as subjects for his paintings. In the years that followed the Armory Show, Hopper began to concentrate on his identity as an American artist and the psychological dimensions of his art. He continued to participate in group exhibitions at smaller venues, such as the MacDowell Club of New York. Shortly after his father's death in 1913, Hopper moved to the Washington Square North apartment in the Greenwich Village section of Manhattan, where he would live for the rest of his life. Certain motifs of Hopper's later more famous works can be seen in his earlier paintings, but the transition from the style he used in France to his American art occurred gradually. Initially there was a change in his choice of motifs, followed by a more profound change in his technique, but there was no obvious abrupt change. The coastline oils Hopper painted in the decade from 1910 to 1920 use strong color contrasts and thick paint, but the pictures that juxtapose nature and civilization during the same period undergo a gradual transition from an impressionist style to Hopper's more characteristic use of realistic detail. He painted the majority of his pure seascapes in the period between 1916 and 1919 on Monhegan Island, in the Gulf of Maine. The natural subject matter he used introduced a new expressive dynamism into his work. Light and shadow, water and land are drawn more clearly, and the colors and contrast are stronger. Although the war years were frustrating times, Hopper gained some recognition. When the First World War started, he was 32, and too old to enlist. Instead, he created this war poster, Smash the Hun, which won the U.S. Shipping Board first prize of $300 in 1918 in an open competition with 1,400 entries. It was produced for the in-house magazine of the Morse Dry Dock and Repair Company in Brooklyn, where Hopper worked as an illustrator. In 1920, Hopper held a one-man exhibition at the Whitney Club, and although none of his pieces sold, it did get his artwork out to the general public, and he became a more recognized name in the art world. In 1915, Hopper discovered etching, a medium that made economic sense to him, as multiple prints could be sold from a single image. It also allowed him the artistic freedom he craved. Hopper's etchings exhibit themes the artist would explore throughout his career: isolated figures, empty streets, strong contrasts between light and shadow, and the play of sunlight on architecture. This print demonstrates the vigorous cross-hatching, deeply bitten lines, and heavy inking that were typical of Hopper's work at the time. Over the next decade, Hopper produced around 70 etchings and dry points, many showing urban scenes of both Paris and New York. Like the paintings for which he would later become renowned, Hopper's etchings embody a sense of alienation and melancholy. One of his better-known works, Night Shadows, created in 1921, features the bird's-eye viewpoint, the dramatic use of light and shadow, and the air of mystery which would serve as inspiration for many film noir movies of the 1940s. The dramatic impact of Night Shadows is a result of the angle at which we see the nighttime walker, his shadow, and the shadow of the tree. The last is not only very large, but it also bisects the right angle of the street corner, as if the composition were a geometrical exercise. It is a dynamic composition, and it generates an unmistakable sense of menace, as if the man's path were taking him beyond a divide, and into a danger zone. Hopper received great acclaim for his etchings over the years, and considered them an essential part of his artistic development. After I took up etching, he said, my painting composition seemed to crystallize. In 1923, Hopper received 2 awards for his etchings, the Logan Prize from the Chicago Society of Etchers, and the W.A. Bryan Prize. During the early 1920s, Hopper's etchings began to receive wide public recognition. He focused on the psychology of individuals within spaces, more than he did in his paintings. These themes began to appear in some of his prints, such as Night on the L Train, Evening Wind, showing a solitary female, and The Catboat, a simple nautical scene. During a summer painting trip in Gloucester, Massachusetts, Hopper re-encountered Josephine Nivison, a former art student of his mentor Robert Henry, whom he had met years earlier. They were opposites. She was short, open, gregarious, sociable, and liberal, while he was tall, secretive, shy, quiet, introspective, and conservative. With Jo's encouragement, Hopper dropped illustrations and turned to watercolor, producing numerous scenes of Gloucester. Although Hopper's etchings are primarily drawn from urban subjects, he chose watercolor to depict his early small-town and rural images. The portability of the medium allowed Hopper to paint outdoors, where he favored local architecture, rather than the picturesque coastal scenes that had made the region a popular artist's colony. In 1923, Hopper's slow climb to recognition finally produced a breakthrough. His girlfriend, Jo Nivison, who was also an artist, encouraged him to join her in participating in a show at the Brooklyn Museum. With help from Jo's connections, 6 of Hopper's Gloucester watercolors were admitted, and one of them, the mansard roof, seen here, was purchased by the museum for its permanent collection for the sum of $100. This was his first sale of a painting to a public institution. His depictions of New England gained Hopper important recognition, and in 1924 he had a solo exhibition at Frank Wren's Fifth Avenue Gallery. The show sold out, and the gallery continued to represent him for the rest of his life. This success enabled Hopper to finally give up illustrating and concentrate on painting. Hopper's earliest artistic success came by way of his watercolors and etchings, rather than the oil paintings for which he is now best known. Additionally, his notebooks contained high-quality pen and pencil sketches, which were never meant for public viewing. The critics generally raved about his work. One stated, "What vitality, force and directness! See what can be done with the homeliest subject." Critics admired his deft handling of the medium, straightforward style, and his ability to transform local architecture into something beautiful. Hopper fared better than many other artists during the Great Depression. His stature took a sharp rise in 1931 when major museums, including the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, paid thousands of dollars for his works. He sold 30 paintings that year, including 13 watercolors. The following year, he participated in the first Whitney Annual, and he continued to exhibit in every annual at the museum for the rest of his life. In 1933, the Museum of Modern Art gave Hopper his first large-scale retrospective. In 1924, Edward Hopper and Jo Nivison married, a union that began when he was 41, and she was 40. Later, not only did she pose for nearly half of the female figure pieces which he created during his career, she also encouraged and pushed him to engage in different art forms as well. She kept records of all the pieces he designed, the exhibitions he was to be a part of, and all of the sales of the pieces which were made during these exhibitions. She became his most ardent supporter and also his art critic. She subordinated her artistic career, favoring his, and sharing his reclusive lifestyle. As they worked together, Hopper adopted Jo's themes of movie theaters and isolated farmhouses, making them his own by the end of his career. The rest of the couple's lives revolved around their small walk-up apartment in Greenwich Village, and their summers in South Truro on Cape Cod, where they painted watercolors side by side. She became his primary model, and his life companion. Despite the pivotal ways Jo's artistic labor accelerated Hopper's career, Edward detested that she hadn't given up painting when they married. He was jealous, yes, but he also expected her to take up the roles of housewife and domestic worker. When she didn't, he expressed his resentment by demeaning her paintings, and even physically abusing her. His growing fame did nothing to satisfy his turbulent insecurities, or make him rethink his unreasonable expectations. Instead, his competitiveness grew. Edward went so far as to draw a literal line down the center of their shared studio. Anything on his side was for his use only, and when Jo finished a piece, it had to be moved into the basement immediately. Another rule Edward enforced forbade Jo from showing her work to the visitors they hosted in their studio. Despite his commercial success, Hopper and Jo lived frugally throughout their lives, only allowing themselves the pleasure of buying books and tickets to theater and films. Hopper particularly loved going to movies. His first documented visit to a cinema was in Paris in 1909. As he explained, "When I don't feel in the mood for painting, I go to the movies for a week or more, a regular movie binge." Hopper was fascinated by the ornate hybrid style of American architecture which his wife Jo called wedding cake houses, a fitting description for this work, which was painted on their honeymoon in Gloucester in 1924. Houses always had a central importance in Hopper's art. He saw them as emblems of civilization. At the same time, they remind us that civilization depends on the laying down of boundaries. Often, Hopper's house pictures show that the separation of mankind from nature is permanent, and we are now barred from nature. House by the Railroad, shown here, is about a lot more than its title indicates. This three-story Victorian building with its distinctive mansard roof sits alone on an elevated plane cut off from the viewer by the harsh horizontal railroad track. Hopper further alienates the viewer by closing the shades in the house, shutting off all opportunity for contact between the residents inside and the threatening march forward of modern life, signified by the railroad tracks. In 1930, House by the Railroad was donated to the newly founded Museum of Modern Art, and became the first painting in their permanent collection. Hopper was delighted later on to learn that Alfred Hitchcock, the film director, used it as inspiration for the house in his 1960s horror film, Psycho. Hopper's portraits and self-portraits were relatively few after his student years, but he did produce a commissioned portrait of a house known as Pretty Penny. Here he faithfully details the Italianate Victorian mansion and home of the First Lady of the American theatre, actress Helen Hayes. The artist and the actress didn't get along, and Hopper found the experience so wearing that he vowed never again to accept a commission. Hopper always liked the way American houses, with their turrets, towers and porches, cast wonderful shadows. His favorite thing, he said, was painting sunlight on the walls of a house. As if to prove the point, his 1963 painting Sunlight in an Empty Room is a pure study of sunlight. In another work, Second Story Sunlight, Hopper focuses on a pair of gabled houses, facing the morning sun. It is an excellent example of how he strived to elevate cityscapes to psychological portraits. Two figures sit on the balcony of one of the houses. One, a scantily clad young woman perched on a railing. The other is an elderly woman, reading a book. Hopper's wife Jo was the model for both figures, as she was for nearly all of the figures included in his later paintings. Although critics and viewers try to see meaning and mood in these works, Hopper insisted that he was more interested in the play of sunlight on the buildings and figures than on any symbolism. Bright sunlight, and the shadows, played symbolically powerful roles in Hopper paintings, and his technique has been compared to similar artistic effects in film. Not all of Hopper's houses depict daylight. Rooms for Tourists, painted in 1945, shows an ambivalent world in which the things that comfort us and the things we find unsettling are shown to have the same origin. The house defies the night, offering comfort and accommodation. The lighted rooms and the sign by the hedge promise security. However, there is nobody to be seen in the house, and the light has a mysterious quality, as if it is all derived from a single source that irradiates throughout the house. Hopper's paintings reveal how he used light to create atmosphere. In this work, we see the crowded glamour of a New York restaurant. He highlights the human figures in the room, drawing our attention to them. This is particularly so for the waitress in the foreground, with her bright white apron. Overall, it is a tranquil painting in which time seems to stand still, but the everyday scene has been transformed by the stage-like atmosphere. Many of Hopper's paintings give the impression of a voyeur, spying on anonymous strangers in their private spaces. Most of Hopper's figure paintings focus on the interaction between a subject and their environment. The feeling is of solitude and loneliness, but he also depicted regret, boredom, and resignation. In an early watercolor, Model Reading, painted in 1925, Hopper reveals the commonplace of urban life. From our vantage point, the work has the feeling of a theater stage set in which the main character is unaware of our presence. He used similar themes and methods in the oil paintings he created during the same period. Room in Brooklyn shows an isolated figure, and strong geometric forms, within a snapshot-like composition, creating an inescapable feeling of loneliness. Again, the piece reminds us of a scene in a theater, with Hopper acting as a set designer, lighting the stage, and organizing the space. In early Sunday morning, Hopper uses light to focus our attention on objects in his picture by creating areas of high contrast, a technique originating in his earlier etchings which he continued to refine throughout his career. Hopper had originally intended to put figures in the upstairs windows, but he finally left them out, to heighten the feeling of desolation. This work was painted during the Great Depression in 1930, and its sense of barrenness and isolation has been seen by some as a comment on the mood of the times. The painting was bought by the Whitney Gallery for $2,000 a few months after it was painted, and it jump-started Hopper's career. His reputation began to build rapidly from then on. He was 48 years old. Two on the Aisle, painted in 1927, illustrates loneliness, even when there are other people in the room. The work sold for a personal record of $1,500 at the time, allowing Hopper to buy a car, which he used to make painting trips to remote areas of New England, especially to the art colony at Monhegan Island. In 1929, Hopper produced his painting, Chop Suey, showing two women seated in a restaurant. Hopper would often eat in restaurants similar to this one, and for this painting, his wife Jo was the model for both women. Despite the company, each woman seems lost in her own thoughts. The couple in the background are similarly disconnected. The high angle of view, and the cropping of both the Chop Suey sign, seen through the window, and the customers on the left, all add a sense of strangeness and alienation to the scene, as though we are catching a glimpse of it while looking through a doorway. Two women, dining alone in a restaurant, would have been seen as inappropriate before 1920. The rise of feminism in the mid-20s contributed to a gradual change, and restaurants began to put up signs in their windows offering tables for ladies. Chop Suey, long considered to be the most famous of Hopper's works in private hands, fetched $92 million at an auction in 2018, placing it among the most expensive American artworks ever sold. Continuing Hopper's theme of loneliness in all its forms, New York Movie, seen here, depicts a nearly empty movie theater occupied with a few scattered moviegoers, and a pensive usherette, lost in her own thoughts. New York Movie is one of Hopper's classic works, which has been praised for its portrayal of multiple light sources. In the background, a movie plays, casting a blanket of light over the audience. Meanwhile, the usherette is lost in her own thoughts, head down and pensive. We're not sure what she's thinking about, but it is that uncertainty that makes the painting interesting. Hopper's individuals are usually depicted as isolated and disconnected from their environment. In this painting, curved geometric forms and angular light provide an almost theatrical setting for the Nighthawks, a group of figures in a diner. Bathed in an oasis of fluorescent light, in an otherwise dark urban street, the Bogart and Bacall couple watch the bar attendant, their hands almost touching. A solitary diner across the counter, with his back to the viewer, looks on. We are witnessing an unfolding narrative, which forces the viewer to try to complete the story. The sense of alienation is heightened by the large window which creates a barrier between the viewer and the subjects. However, it is not the figures in the diner that are lonely, it is the viewer, standing outside the pool of light, looking in, who experiences the sense of being separated from the group. The significance of this painting was recognized soon after its completion when the Art Institute of Chicago purchased it for $3,000. Today is the most requested and sought-after image in their collection. Nighthawks has become one of the iconic American images of the 20th century. Hopper's painting, Gas, offers a perfect example of the artist's ability to raise a simple subject, with no action, to that of a psychologically charged one. Here, he depicts a single figure, a lone gas station attendant, within an overall quiet and bleak setting, enlivened slightly by the presence of the red gas pumps. The work skillfully brings together several of Hopper's themes: the solitary figure, the gloom of dusk, and the lonely road. The insignificance of the figure within the scene is emphasized by the dramatic treatment of the background. The gas station seems to be an outpost marking the frontier of civilization. Both the color contrasts and the compositional structure underline this tension. In the summers of 1937 and 1938, Hopper and his wife spent extended periods in Vermont, where Hopper painted a series of watercolors along the White River. These scenes are not typical of Hopper's mature works, as many of them are pure landscapes, without architecture or human figures. First Branch of the White River, now in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, is the best known of Hopper's Vermont landscape works. Hopper made idiosyncratic use of perspective in these landscapes, and in a few of them, allowed signs of civilization, such as houses, to mark his boundaries. Many of the scenes and nearby attractions which they visited and painted in their travels through Vermont were often seen in the pictures he created later on in his career. Hopper also started to travel further out, visiting regions as far away as Charleston, to add new interest to his collection. The theme of depicting a lonely, dejected single woman in a painting had been used by many artists before Hopper. Works such as Edouard Manet's impressionistic masterpiece, The Plum, painted in 1877, and Edgar Degas' Absinthe from 1876, illustrate the theme. Hopper's solitary figures are mostly women, often reading or looking out a window. In the early 1920s, Hopper painted his first such image, Girl at Sewing Machine, where he uses a window in front of her as a prominent device in the composition. Here, Hopper is not attempting to capture a photographic representation of his subject, but a subtle feeling that infused the painting, through his use of color and his painting technique. The composition gives us the impression that we are catching a glimpse of her through a doorway, as she works at her machine. A moment frozen in time. Hopper continued the theme with another woman sewing in New York interior. This time, the viewer appears to be looking through a window at the woman sewing, while she sits on a bed, perhaps mending her dress. Many of Hopper's paintings suggest that the viewer is a hidden observer, stealing a look at an intimate and private scene. Years later, Hopper claimed that he developed many of his subjects after a glimpse through a window while riding in a train or walking in his neighborhood at night. In 1927, Hopper painted Automat, where a woman seems to be taking refuge in a local diner. The picture focuses on the isolation of the woman, who appears dejected and lonely, despite being in a place usually flooded with people. Surrounded by the emptiness of the night behind her, with only a cup of coffee for company, her focus remains on her drink, as if it's the only thing in the world. The scene is vibrant in its starkness. When Hopper painted this picture, automats, which were self-serve dining facilities, had begun to be promoted as safe and proper places for the working woman to dine alone. To a New Yorker in the 1920s, Hopper's automat would have sent a clear message. The painting was first displayed at the opening of Hopper's second solo show. Hopper's wife, Jo, was the model. It sold for $1,200 in 1927. Hotel Room, painted in 1931, is more representative of Hopper's mature style, emphasizing the solitude more overtly. The sense of being alone is very strong in this powerful and emotive painting. Framed by the vertical lines of the room and the diagonal of the bed, the woman's isolation is exaggerated by the room's bright light, as she stares at a yellow piece of paper, leading the viewer to wonder what she is thinking. Hotel Room was the first of several paintings that Hopper set in hotel rooms and lobbies, highlighting the isolation of life away from home. Not all of Hopper's single women paintings display negative feeling. In Cape Cod Morning, a woman looks out a bay window, apparently gazing at something beyond the picture. She is framed by tall, dark shutters and the shaded facade of the window. The painting tells no story, instead, the woman's pose creates a sense of anticipation in the viewer. Hopper's paintings are sometimes given interpretations that Hopper had not intended. When Joe Hopper commented, "It's a woman looking out to see if the weather's good enough to hang out her wash," Hopper retorted, "Did I say that? You're making it Norman Rockwell. As I see it, she's just looking out the window." Hopper was sometimes compared to his contemporary, artist Norman Rockwell, because of the similarity of their subject matter. Hopper did not like the comparison. He considered himself more subtle, less illustrative, and certainly not sentimental like Rockwell. "I think the American scene painters caricatured America," he said. "I always wanted to be myself." This work, Morning Sun, was produced late in Hopper's life, when he was nearly 70 years old. Nevertheless, it explores the same themes. Here, Hopper paints his wife Jo at the age of 68, sitting upright on a neatly made bed, staring out the window. The morning sun streams through the window, raking over the figure and onto the blank wall behind. The artist obscures details of her aging face and figure by a distinct lack of detail. Her expression is ambiguous, perhaps pensive, perhaps regretful. As in much of Hopper's work, the figure is included to capture a mood, or suggest a psychological effect, rather than to serve as the portrait of an individual. Here, Hopper adopts the window motif to add psychological weight to his picture, providing the possibility of varied interpretation. The painting, which was purchased for $3,500 by the Columbus Museum of Art in 1954, is Hopper at his best. It hints at the bare bones of a narrative, with the kind of spare suggestive style that has since influenced filmmakers and photographers. Hopper and his wife Jo traveled to Mexico in the summer of 1943, in search of artistic inspiration. Their trip was initially delayed by wartime petrol rationing, forcing them to travel by train from New York instead of taking their car. They explored Mexico City and its famous sights, but were not inspired to paint them. Following advice from an art dealer, they moved to Saltillo, a less populated and more temperate city in northern Mexico. Despite some challenges with the heat and the weather, Hopper created a series of watercolors, capturing the local landscape and architecture. Hopper returned to Saltillo in 1946, and again in 1951 and 1952. He painted from the rooftop of a house, capturing the city's unique architecture and surroundings. Hopper's interest lay in mundane elements of the city, such as water tanks, chimneys, and utility infrastructure. His work focused on the interplay of light and shadow, and its effect on the desert landscape. However, Hopper grew frustrated with Saltillo's rapid urban development, which threatened to obscure the views he was looking for. Hopper's Mexican journey left a lasting impact on his art, introducing new elements and colors into his compositions, and influencing his approach to capturing light in his pictures. Despite the challenges and frustrations, his Mexican works remained a significant aspect of his artistic development. Ultimately, his watercolor period ended after a trip to the American West in 1946, as he shifted away from working directly from nature. When asked why this was, he replied, "Because I have been doing the watercolors from nature, and I don't work from nature anymore." The mood, in many of Hopper's paintings featuring couples, appears to mirror Hopper's own withdrawn personality, and his relationship with his gregarious wife Jo. They draw on pronounced male-female stereotypes, typical of attitudes prevalent in the early 20th century, some of which continue today. In Room in New York, a man sits reading a newspaper, interpreted at the time as suggesting his intellect and pragmatic character. The woman, seated opposite, turns to make music, suggesting her artistic, more emotional, feminine nature. She is shown as disturbing the oppressive silence, interjecting her presence, demanding his attention. He is introspective, withdrawn, unresponsive. In Office at Night, the man focuses on his work, while nearby, a woman, perhaps his secretary, pulls a file from a cabinet. Several studies for the painting show how Hopper experimented with the positioning of the two figures, choosing the most provocative and sensual female stance and figure from various possibilities, so as to heighten the eroticism and tension in his work. Hopper presents the viewer with the possibilities that the man is either truly uninterested in the woman's appeal, or that he is working hard to ignore her. Hopper elevates what might be a simple scene from everyday life within an office, through an extremely raised angle of perspective. The psychological tension between the figures depicted within the room is achieved through the compression of the space between them. It is impossible for the viewer to guess what will happen next. As he does in so many paintings, Hopper provides no narrative beyond the moment that he has captured. He created several office pictures, but no others with the sensual undercurrent he achieved in this. Hopper takes the couple's theme to a more ambitious level with his late painting, Excursion into Philosophy, shown here. A middle-aged man sits dejectedly on the edge of a bed. Beside him lies an open philosophy book, and behind him, a partially clad woman. A shaft of light illuminates the floor in front of him. He seems to be contemplating the meaning of his life, and his relationship with the woman. Does he see a conflict between the inner world of the mind, and the physical world of sexual relationships? He is paralyzed in his depression. Though Hopper claimed that he didn't consciously embed psychological meaning in his paintings, he was deeply interested in Freud, and the power of the subconscious mind. He wrote in 1939, "So much of every painting is an expression of the subconscious, that it seems to me that most of the important qualities are put there by our unconscious, and little by our conscious mind." As if to support this view, Hopper's Summer Evening shows a young couple talking in the harsh light of a cottage porch. The picture could be interpreted as inescapably romantic, but Hopper was hurt by one critic's suggestion that it would do for an illustration in any woman's magazine. "The figures are not what interested me," he said. "It was the light streaming down, and the night all around, that I was trying to capture." In Hopper's People in the Sun, 5 people sit on the terrace of a hotel gazing toward a line of distant mountains. Stark contrasts and cool light emphasize their static poses and deadpan expressions. The painting was initially inspired by sunbathers in Washington Square Park, near the New York City apartment the artist shared with his wife, Jo. Hopper changed the locale here to a Western setting, drawing on memories of tourist destinations he visited in the American West. The figures, crowded into the lower left quadrant, observe, but remain apart from the natural setting. The abstracted environment veers between a real view and a movie set, as if Hopper was silently replaying a film about the discomfort of city dwellers, confronting the vastness of the Western landscape. Hopper paid particular attention to geometrical design, and the careful placement of human figures, in proper balance with their environment in his works. He was a slow and methodical artist, he wrote. "It takes a long time for an idea to strike. Then, I have to think about it for a long time. I don't start painting until I have it all worked out in my head." He often made many preparatory sketches to work out his carefully calculated compositions. In the 1940s and 50s, Hopper found himself losing critical favor with the rise of abstract expressionism. Among the new art movements that emerged in the early 1940s, artists such as Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko advanced audacious formal inventions, in a search for significant content, leaving Hopper and his realist style behind. But Hopper continued to express in his paintings the feelings he thought most people identified with. In Summertime, painted in 1943, Hopper documents the economic upswing caused by the war, the mood of anticipation that was beginning to affect the nation, and the new relaxed morals of youth in America. A young girl in a see-through dress is standing outside a tenement. The outfit, obviously new, suggests the increased prosperity of the nation, which at last had been able to put aside many of the difficulties of the Depression years. In another of his feel-good paintings, Girly Show, a red-headed striptease queen strides confidently across a stage, to the accompaniment of the musicians in the pit. Girly Show was inspired by Hopper's visit to a burlesque show a few days earlier. Hopper's wife, Jo, as usual, posed for him for the painting, and noted in her diary, "Ed beginning a new canvas. A burlesque queen, doing a striptease. With me posing without a stitch on, in front of the stove. Nothing but high heels and a sweeping dance pose." The motifs that link Hopper's works often leave a trail of psychological clues, signs of American society's repressed physical desires and perception, although they may say more about the artist than the society in which he lived. Hopper's South Carolina Morning expresses a tension open to several interpretations. In this almost geometrical composition, the woman in her bright red dress and black shoes is the picture's main focus. The effect Hopper achieves is an ambiguous one. She is dressed as if to go out, and seems to be waiting for something. At the same time, she projects a smoldering sexual challenge to the viewer. Hopper was stoic and fatalistic. A quiet, introverted man, he had a gentle sense of humor and a frank manner. In 1966, he was awarded the Edward MacDowell Medal by the MacDowell Colony for outstanding contributions to American culture. Hopper's final oil painting, Two Comedians, painted 1 year before his death, focuses on his love of the theater. Two pantomime actors, one male and one female, both dressed in bright white costumes, take their bow in front of a darkened stage. Jo Hopper confirmed that her husband intended the figures to suggest they are taking their life's last bows together as husband and wife. The stage on which the two figures stand is not yet empty, but we are aware that it soon will be, and when they have departed, we will be left only with a void. Edward Hopper died of natural causes in his studio near Washington Square, in New York City, on May 15, 1967. He was 85 years old. He is buried in the family plot, along with his sister and his parents, in Nyack's Oak Hill Cemetery. At that time, there were only 6 people at Hopper's funeral. The Hoppers didn't have a wide art circle, and Hopper was out of place as a realist painter in an art world dominated by abstract expressionists. It would take 15 years after his death before he was rediscovered. His wife Jo died 10 months later, and was laid to rest beside her husband. The pair bequeathed their joint collection of more than 3,000 works to the Whitney Museum of American Art. Other significant paintings by Hopper are held by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Des Moines Art Center, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Hopper's birthplace and boyhood home was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2000. It is now operated as the Edward Hopper House, Museum, and Study Center. It serves as a non-profit community cultural center, featuring exhibitions, workshops, lectures, performances, and special events. In 1980, the show, Edward Hopper, The Art and the Artist, opened at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and visited London, Dusseldorf, and Amsterdam, as well as San Francisco and Chicago. For the first time ever, this show presented Hopper's oil paintings, together with preparatory studies for those works. This was the beginning of Hopper's popularity in Europe, and his expanding worldwide reputation. In 2004, a large selection of Hopper's paintings toured Europe, visiting Museum Ludwig in Cologne, Germany, and the Tate Modern in London. The Tate exhibition became the second most popular in the gallery's history, with 420,000 visitors in the 3 months it was open. Works by Edward Hopper rarely appear on the market. The artist was not prolific, painting just 366 canvases throughout his life. During the 1950s, when he was in his 70s, he produced approximately 5 paintings a year. Hopper's longtime dealer, Frank Wren, who gave the artist his first solo show in 1924, sold this painting, hotel window to a collector in 1957 for $7,000. In 2006, it was resold for $26.9 million at Sotheby's, New York. This was an auction record for the artist, and confirmation of his reputation and the importance of his art to the world. Hopper has inspired countless painters, photographers, filmmakers, writers, and musicians, and the term Hopperesque is now widely used to mean images reminiscent of Hopper's moods and subjects. He has had no less of an impact on cinema. Generations of filmmakers have drawn inspiration from Hopper's dramatic viewpoints, lighting, and overall moods. His 1925 painting, House by the Railroad, inspired film director Alfred Hitchcock's House in Psycho, in 1960, as well as that in Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven in 1978. Edward Hopper never lacked popular appeal. By the time of his death in 1967, he had been reclaimed as a major influence by a new generation of American realist artists. His ability to capture the essence of solitude and isolation in his work was legendary, and his unique command of light and shadow reveal a world of quiet contemplation and introspection in his paintings. Hopper's art spoke to the profound and often lonely depths of the human experience, resonating with viewers across generations.